As far as marketing terms go, I think the cloud was very clever. Of all the metaphors they could have picked, they picked that specifically for the effect that it has. Because when you talk about the cloud in terms of digital technology, it really does feel like you're describing something that is weightless. I mean, it's a cloud. It exists above us somewhere, separate from physical reality. And I mean, like all marketing terms, this is misleading because I think it's something that we've kind of come to terms with recently. We're talking about AI because we're all finding out that AI uses this, massive amount of water and, computer chips and processors. So what feels like is happening, magically on your computer is actually happening in a data center in Tennessee somewhere. So it's all happening in a physical space and it's using real water. So we're learning about this now, but deep down, it's always been like this. Every YouTube video you watch, it is happening in a data center somewhere. And it's a real place with fans that have to keep everything cool. And that data is going through real wires. And there's, copper wiring going underneath the ocean that is carrying all of this stuff. So as much as it feels like we've kind of ascended to a digital existence, beneath all of that, the world is still happening in a physical place. The physical world can exist without the digital world, but the digital world cannot exist without the physical because it's all happening somewhere. And that's the thing about the cloud is like it's happening in the cloud and you're experiencing it, on your screen, but it is happening somewhere else. You're not in the same room as your stove, but your stove doesn't exist in the cloud. It's just in the other room. I think part of living in the post-industrial world and spending all day on the computer, it feels like we're on a path and we've gone past the physical world, and it feels like we're existing in a purely digital place. But I think part of living in modern society is a kind of denial of the fact that a whole lot of the world still operates very much the same way that it did 300 years ago. It just feels different on our end, but it's all still there. The vast majority of global trade still happens via ship. It's still a boat going through the water. You may have heard of Moore's Law, which is basically that computers double in power every 18 months or so. Not an exact thing, but it is basically true. There's no Moore's Law for ships. A container ship coming from China still takes about as long as it did 50, 100 years ago. Planes, air travel is more frequent and more established. But, after the Concorde, air travel has not become significantly faster. Flying from New York to London still takes about 7 hours. And that's not changing because that's how far away London is. And that's how fast our planes go. And that's especially true for ships in the water because the ocean is still the ocean and we haven't solved for that. When we think about globalization, people tend to think about tourism. And, you get on a plane and you go to Tokyo and you look around. Or maybe people think in terms of digital nomads. So you take your laptop and you move to Thailand for a while. But most of global trade, like I said, is still happening on boats. And the boats are so much more important than the planes. You could take away every plane and you could ground all air travel. It would be kind of annoying. If you took away every ship from the ocean, we would all starve. The entire economy would freeze up and people would literally die because that is still how the world works. Commodities get put on a ship somewhere and they go to a different place and they get unloaded. And there's no way around that. There's nothing about our current technology. There's no coding you can do to circumvent that necessity. And I think part of living in modern society is trying to forget that, because we live in a consumer culture. And part of consumer culture is consumer confidence, meaning that you go out and you spend $500 on that TV. The only reason you're doing that is because somewhere in your head, you still imagine that you can go back to the store next week and the shelves will be full, because that is the confidence that we've tried to put in your head to make you feel good about consuming. And that's how the economy drives. But if you didn't think that was possible, if you thought there was going to be a shortage coming up, you might not buy that TV. And if everybody stops buying, this whole thing falls apart. But we only experience these things as outcomes. We experience the internet as something that happens on our screen. We don't think about all the pipes and wiring that actually got it to us, because that would be too much. That would ruin the experience. So what we do instead is we kind of lie to ourselves and tell ourselves that the thing that we're experiencing is happening in the room right now. And all of this data is just abstract. It's not happening in a real place. But I really feel like, especially when you talk about things like geopolitics, it can feel almost scientific and academic when you hear people talk about global trade and you hear about trade imbalances and, currency fluctuations or whatever. But I really think the best way to understand geopolitics, because all politics is geopolitics, the best way to understand geopolitics really is to just look at a map. The Chinese economy is still highly dependent on oil, crude oil. And China gets their oil from the Gulf states. So if you really want to understand the Chinese economy from a geopolitical standpoint, pick up a map and look at the Gulf states and draw a line to China, keeping in mind that oil goes on boats, so it's got to go in the water. So draw that line from the Gulf states to the Chinese coast and look at every country you go by. That is, every country you pass by on the way to China is a potential problem for the Chinese government. Every time you see the land get kind of narrow and you see there's a canal or there's a thing that's called it's a strait or whatever, that is a potential vulnerability. And the Chinese government is doing its absolute best to make sure it controls every one of those choke points. Because if something goes wrong, if the, what was it, the thing that happened in the Suez Canal where the boat got stuck? It was a physical boat, just happened to go horizontal, and billions of dollars of trade got shut down instantly, because that's how much we need boats to go through the water. And that is physical reality. That is deep down how the world still works. And that's how the world worked 300 years ago. You still had to get something on a boat, and it had to get to where it had to get to safely. And what's happening now is you're seeing Trump is Trump's foreign policy is basically isolationism. So, hey, we're not going to be the world's police anymore, which most of us from a, ethical standpoint feel okay about. But what you got to keep in mind is that the US Navy didn't exist purely for war. The US Navy exists to protect trade routes, to protect that boat that has to get from China to Long Beach. And if there's no protection and there's no enforcement of, trade routes, what you end up with is the 1500s. You end up with pirates, and that becomes your concern. So despite the fact that we live in a world of fabulous technology and fun YouTube videos, we also live in a world of pirates in the middle of the ocean who are straight up stealing things, because that is still the reality that we live in. That's why it was so stupid to me, sort of post-pandemic, there's this huge argument in America about the future of work. And people were talking about, are we going to work from home or do we have to go back to the office? And that became this existential question for people, because Americans work in the knowledge economy. If you have a good white-collar job, you are an information worker. You spend your time on the computer. But this entire concept of the knowledge economy is kind of fake, because it's a knowledge economy on your end because you're on the computer. But everything you're doing on the computer is happening in the dirt. It's happening in cobalt mines. It's lithium that is being put on a ship and sent somewhere. Nothing you're doing in your work from home job exists separate from everything else. It feels like it does because you are at home, typing on your computer. But you haven't graduated from anything. You're still a part of the world. And I think that is going to be a very important distinction moving forward, because the digital world is still physical. And I think we're going to feel that more and more. And that is increasingly what the news is really about. When you hear about ICE raids, ICE isn't sending emails. They're not, sending you a text message that you can delete. That is a guy who shows up to your door and takes you away. When people get kicked off of their health insurance because Medicaid got cut, that is not a digital thing. That is real world. The price of eggs, that's not something that can be solved through software. That is still real dirt, physical world. That's something that cannot be avoided. And so I think that is where everything is headed. We're going to find out more and more that what we think about as the digital world was more of a detour. It was a marketing tool. It was something to make you feel frictionless. It was telling you that you live in the cloud, even though you still live in the real world. And the real world still has physical laws. Things are still far apart and they're heavy. And they got to get from one place to another. Ironically, I think the thing that we're going to have to learn more about, the places that we're going to have to learn from, the role models, are going to end up being the supposedly less developed countries. The parts of the world that still rely on physical space, that still have ties to the land, that still have social bonds and family bonds that exist in the real world and aren't mediated digitally. Because moving forward, I think those are going to be the places that are actually resilient to change. Meanwhile, all we're going to have is more people who know how to code And that's going to be a real problem when you need tomatoes, because tomatoes still exist in the real world. My point is that what we call the digital world is physical. Not only that, but it's always been physical. All we've been doing this entire time is trying to avoid what comes next.